evening and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. The United States is hosting separate talks of Russia and Ukraine in Saudi Arabia, aimed to establish at least a limited ceasefire. The talks are set to concentrate on protecting energy infrastructure and safety for shipping in the Black Sea. To discuss what we can expect and what are some of the key aspects of these negotiations, I have Brent Sadler, Senior Fellow, Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation, joining me right now. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and good evening.
Let me start with an insider's question, as I believe that your organization is adjacent to the current administration. What is Trump's administration perception of Ukraine, and does it influence policy?
Well, it's a good question. We know, quite frankly, even at Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank based in D.C., and certainly one that aligns a lot with many in his administration, it's from his public statements and his actions so far. Clearly, President Trump's priority is to end the war in Ukraine. There is a greater geostrategic calculation that really considers China in this. But as far as to his feelings about Ukraine specifically, I think it's an open question. His experience with Zelensky in the White House was problematic, as put on public display. But again, the bigger interest here, U.S. national interest, is first and foremost, and America first priorities that President Trump has frequently articulated. So if it doesn't meet bettering American safety, American economic security, and deterring a China war, it's probably not going to survive as a policy path going forward.
And just on that, Poland's foreign minister said that trust in the United States depends on the quality of the decision, on the ability of Trump administration to achieve this ceasefire. They're hoping to do so by Easter. So do you agree with this statement?
I'm not sure that's a good metric. These negotiations, quite frankly, will probably play out for many weeks, not just until the Easter holiday. So I think trying to put like a deadline or to assess trust in all this is probably the wrong metric. Rather, it's about supporting and applying pressure on Putin to enter in negotiations in a sincere way, which we have not seen yet. And of course, there is a lot of pressure that I think has yet to be brought to bear on the Russians. And I think that may be an issue coming in future meetings between the U.S. and Russia.
All right, let me just clarify for our viewers that the deadline was mentioned by the Trump administration, not by a Polish foreign minister, of course. But speaking about Russia's willingness to negotiate, they really have a quite interesting makeup of their delegation to Saudi Arabia, and it does include an FSB official. So do you think that it is an attempt to perhaps sabotage these talks? Because it's a rather interesting choice, right?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if there's intelligence officials from the Russian side in this, trying to ascertain openings and weaknesses in the U.S. negotiation position or to influence it. And I think the U.S. side is very prepared for that type of activities by the Russians' part. There is no trust in any of the parties, only the cold reality of the realities on the battlefield and nation-state power that can be exercised that has yet been brought to bear.
And you've mentioned that Russia's participation, of course, is and will is, of course, crucial. And we saw firsthand that the U.S. has leverage over Ukraine. You've mentioned the Oval Office meeting. But what about leverage over Russia? What methods can the U.S. use to make Russia more willing, perhaps, to negotiate?
Well, first there's the economics. So even though there's been sanctions applied, European nations continue to buy fuel from Russia. That should stop, and the U.S. should be able to provide fuel in its place. The money that continues to flow into Russia's coffers needs to stop. That's one. Two, the dark fleet that Russia uses to avoid sanctions and provide fuel around the world also needs to be put under increasing pressure. And finally, on the economic front, the loopholes that allowed exemptions to business dealings and financial transfers needs to be closed. It's a very easy thing to do, and that will severely cut off any remaining financial flows from the West. But of course, the next level of this is China, and more pressure needs to be put on the Chinese to cut off their economic, military support that they've been providing to the Russians, and that does include Iran and North Korea, but it's the Chinese that have to face much more stringent pressure. to isolate the Russians more fully.
And Yuri Ushakov, foreign policy aide to Vladimir Putin, he said that, and going back to the talks, of course, that their aim is mainly to study the prospects for the possible implementation of a well-known initiative related to the safety of the navigation in the Black Sea. And I know that maritime policy is your specialty, so could you please unpack this and explain this?
Well, it sounds like the Russians are trying to return to the grain deal, and I think Ukraine would benefit from that as well. But of course, the details are not really known, so it's hard to comment on exactly what the Russians are after. Again, the Ukrainians have been able to apply significant naval pressure through the use of drones, forcing the Black Sea fleet to retreat from Crimea to the east. And so this has the potential of providing Russia a benefit with very little return to the Ukrainians, and show there should be a high bar, a price for the Russians to pay to get back to some type of understanding in the Black Sea.
Right. And Mr. Putin is quite adamant with his demands, and they, of course, include Ukraine not joining NATO and also a reduction in NATO's presence in Central and Eastern Europe. And do you think he has any chance of getting these goals met?
I think a lot of what Putin is doing is distraction to move away from what really he thinks his bottom line is and what he can achieve. And so I give very little credit to what his public statements are. But again, I think it also is reflective of there hasn't been enough defeat for the Russian forces on the battlefield to compel him to a more, I guess, favorable public posture on getting to a peace negotiation. And he hasn't been able to, we have not in the West been able to cut him off from his financial and military sources of assistance with enough effect to force him to also enter into the negotiations yet in a more sincere manner. And sadly, with the conditions on the ground and the weather, there's still several months of fighting that could be occurring before we get to a position where military operations naturally start to go into a lull.
Mm-hmm. And one of the another key aim, of course, is securing key infrastructure in Ukraine. And my question is, what is the significance of the Zaporizhzhia power plant?
Well, that power plant in particular is significant for Ukraine as it provides a significant amount of energy to the areas that are currently the front lines. And it is one of the more modern, one of the larger of the power plants in Ukraine. So it would want that back most certainly, and trying to include it in a provision of transfer of territory as well as protection of other existing energy infrastructure is important for Ukraine. But it's also important to note that Russia's petroleum and its own energy networks have come under Ukrainian drone strikes very far into Russia proper. So there hasn't been enough effective utility or a cost on the Russians, quite frankly, to really see an honest negotiation that's more equitable on both sides. Again, the details really matter on this.
Mm-hmm. But what's the reason for American interest in that power plant?
The interest of the United States is the same there. It is a significant source of energy. It being on the front lines and coming under previously direct attack by Russian forces does pose an ecological, radiological catastrophe. But the plant's been at reduced operating status for some time now, so the odds of that are lesser. But that remains a U.S. concern.
Well, this is not the first round of talks. So what led to the failure of previous negotiations, and could this happen again?
Well, I guess if we're talking about negotiations in the last few weeks, I consider this all part of the same negotiating approach. We're really in the first step, the first movement, and there'll be several before we actually see both Moscow and Kyiv come formally, officially into a ceasefire negotiation, a substantive one. So these are all the early maneuvers and maneuvering to sense out what the other side's red lines. But if you go back further, the failure of the Minsk Treaty, I think, stands out for its inability to hold the Russians to account and also to apply costs when they reneged on the terms of the agreement.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, the New York Times wrote that Mr. Witkoff echoed a Kremlin talking point on Sunday in an interview, basically talking about referendums in the occupied territories. He said there are referendums within these territories that justify these actions, and of course they've been regarded as fraudulent by the international community. So do you think that this is a danger, the administration buying into the Russian narrative and perhaps spreading it, right?
Well, I mean, if I step back, I mean, you had Mike Waltz, the president's national security advisor, his closest advisor on all matters of national security. He didn't echo those type of sentiments, and he hasn't in the past either. So I'm not too concerned about, a slip up or the potential infiltration of Russian propaganda, as long as the pressure that's being applied to Moscow and the goal of getting to a ceasefire that serves American national interest is pursued. And there certainly is no question about that in President Trump.
And what is the best possible outcome, in your view, of these negotiations taking place in Riyadh?
Well, I think the best possible way forward is that there is an understanding, a line of control, a territorial understanding, whether it's a final solution. And remember, the Baltic states were annexed by the Soviet Union, but not recognized by the United States, despite trying to pursue détente. So I think it's important, whatever that line of control or contact is, that it is one to where Russia, if it decides to reinitiate hostilities, that it would be done at such a high cost that they would be deterred from doing it. The same from the Ukrainians. And it means taking into the military tactical considerations along the terrain. But it also has a longer term question, and that is that Ukraine is able to arm itself more effectively.
Absolutely. And Zelensky mentioned, I mean, as a part of the deal, right, that foreign peacekeeping forces should be in Ukraine. He mentioned the U.S., right? So do you think that's possible in any way?
Not in the near term. And the most notable effort on this, and I do think it's helpful that the UK and France have decided to take kind of a leading rhetorical kind of lead inside Europe to try to rally support of European nations to provide such a force. But the military capability capacity of those nations is sorely lacking to enforce anything in Ukraine, certainly against Russia, if they were to get into hostilities. And we're talking many months, if not a year away from any of that type of force being ready to go into Ukraine. And that assumes that there is a ceasefire in place first. There's no one that is talking about going into Ukraine while open hostilities are still raging.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for being with us this evening. Much appreciated. Brent Sadler, Senior Fellow, Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and have a good night.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.